For this month, the theme is about trust, the practice of trust. Also, this week begins Lent, and it culminates with Holy Week and the Passion of Jesus of Nazareth, which gave me the idea behind my talk. And that is, what was the real relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and Judas Iscariot? From the four canonical Gospels, we all know the story of Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed his good friend for 30 pieces of silver. And such a betrayal that he invited unto himself all the hatred and just absolute disgust that people have, even with his name. The name Judas is synonymous with being called the ultimate personal betrayer. For 2,000 years, that has been the story. And what was Judas's reward? You have to go to the 9th level of hell, where Satan spends eternity torturing Judas for what he did. However, there is an alternate story. In the year 2000, an ancient manuscript was discovered with the title, The Gospel of Judas. Now, biblical scholars knew that the Gospel of Judas had existed at one time. Early Christian writers wrote about it. But all they said about it, it was heretical, and if you got a copy, burn it. Fortunately, one copy survived, and that is the copy that came down to us. It was not in good shape, it was missing parts, and it took well over a year for the best scholars to translate it. But it is an interesting story that is in this gospel, which I want to relate to you as an alternative vision of who Judas Iscariot may have been. The gospel begins with Jesus at the beginning of Passion Week coming upon his apostles praying. He watches them, and when they finish, he scoffs at them. He belittles them, and he says, "You do not know what you are doing. You are leading people astray. I don't understand you. How can you pray this way?" Well, his apostles got a little irritated with Jesus. And they started mumbling against him and cursing him. And Jesus looks at all of them and says, "There is not one among you who can come up here and stand in front of me." All the apostles started mumbling to themselves, but they hung their heads and averted their eyes. They would not look at Jesus, except one. Judas Iscariot walks up, stands in front of Jesus, but he won't look at him. And he says, "I know who you are and where you came from." Jesus looks at him and laughs. Yes, he laughs. Now, a little side note here. In the four canonical Gospels, Jesus never shows the emotion of laughing. In the Gospel of Judas, he laughs 6 times. And there's something to that. Why didn't Jesus ever laugh in the stories that came down to us? Yet in this non-canonical gospel, this heretical gospel, he laughs. He laughs, and then he says to Judas, "You and I are going to go off. I have something to tell you and a task that I wish for you to perform." So Judas and Jesus walk off away from the other apostles. And when they get someplace private, Jesus says to Judas, "I am going to give you the knowledge of the kingdom. I am going to tell you information that I'm not going to tell the other apostles. That's only for you. And I have a task for you that only you can do. And Judas says to Jesus, Master, I had a vision that I wish to share with you, if you're willing to listen. And Jesus replies, of course, I'll listen. And Judas says, in my vision, I do your deed. And the next thing is, the apostles are dragging me to a field. They throw me into this field and they stone me to death because of what I do. They abuse me terribly. And Jesus looks at him and he laughs. He says, yes, 13th one, that could happen. Now, another side note. Jesus refers to Judas throughout the Gospel as the 13th one. Now, I should point out that this Gospel was written about 125 AD, 30 to 50 years after the 4 canonical Gospels were written. So it is very much assumed that whoever wrote this Gospel was familiar with the other Gospels. And it was written by a member of what we call the Gnostic Christian sect, which was in opposition to what we'd call the Proto-Orthodox sect, of which the 4 canonical Gospels come out of. And the Proto-Orthodox become what we call modern Christianity someday. So this Gnostic sect is a sect that disappears after several centuries. And the author uses the term 13th one is because he is mocking and criticizing the canonical Gospels, because you might remember is after the death of Judas in the canonical Gospels, the other apostles pick a replacement for Judas, a man called Matthias. Well, in the Gospel of Judas, the author is saying, how dare you replace Judas, who was picked by Jesus himself? And it's all contained in just one little phrase, 13th one. And Jesus continues saying, you are right. You will be persecuted. You will be held in contempt throughout future generations. But those very people who are contemptuous of you are going to be jealous when they see you standing and sitting next to me in the kingdom where you will rule them. Judas says, but Master, I will be an abomination to everyone for years to come. What do you wish for me to do? And Jesus responds saying, you are the only one I can trust to do the deed. And what I want you to do is to help me escape this earthly body so that I can return to the Godhead. And you are the only one who can do it. Judas reluctantly agrees to do the deed. And this is at the end of the gospel. Jesus and Judas are in a house. And Jesus leaves Judas and goes off into a room to pray. Judas goes out the front door, and out in the street are the priests and the scribes. And they were waiting, trying to figure out a way how they were going to take Jesus into, arrest him and then take him to the Roman authorities. And one of the priests sees Judas and says, you are one of his followers. And Judas agrees that he is, and he takes them and he leads them into the house. And he hands Jesus over to them. And before Judas can walk off, one of the priests throws him a bag, and in the bag are a few copper coins. And Judas leaves to go meet his fate at the hands of the apostles. And that is the end of the Gospel of Judas. Now, there's several things out of this gospel that you have to consider. Why did this author say that the other apostles kill Judas? He didn't hang himself. He was killed by his other apostles. Remember, this gospel was written years after the other gospels. Could it be this was one of those rumors that was going around that nobody wanted to talk about? He was exposing a scandal, and it certainly would have been. I will give you a scenario. Think of after Jesus is arrested, all the apostles flee. Peter denies them, and then he ends up fleeing. They all gather in a room in some building in Jerusalem, all sitting around feeling miserable. Then one of them stands up and says, "You know, there is nothing we can do for our master. He's hanging on a cross. We can't do anything for him because there's a Roman guard and they'll kill all of us. But we can make that man pay for it who betrayed him." And it is not so unlikely that they all would have got up and found themselves a mission and went and found Judas and slayed him for what he had done. And I can tell you, in 30 AD, if they would have taken him to the field and they would have stoned him, if you as a passerby, as a Jewish male, was walking by and you went up to him and said, "Why are you stoning that man?" And they would have said to you, "That our master hangs on a Roman cross because of him," you would have picked up a rock and thrown it at him as well. And you would have said, "Roman collaborator," but which would be one of the ultimate contemptuous things you could say about a fellow Jewish person. So the idea that that could have happened is not totally unrealistic. So you have to ask yourself, which story do you trust? Do you trust the canonical Gospels that have been used to tell the story for the last 2,000 years? Or do you trust this non-canonical Gospel, which existed for 2,000 years? It was written way back, 125 AD. I will give you a little hint. Professors are good at doing that. We'll give you a little hint. Think of this. In the Gospel of John, in the Bible, we're talking the canonical Gospel of John, on the night before Jesus was crucified, while they're at their supper, Jesus leans over and says to Judas, "Go and do what you must do." Well, it is pretty obvious that Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. That's obvious. Second thing is, he must have approved of what Judas was going to do, because all he could have said was to the other apostles, "Hey, all you guys, this guy is going to go betray me and turn me over to the Romans." And Judas never would have left that room. But he didn't do that. In fact, he ordered him to go and do the deed. So take that in mind when you think of the story here. What was the relationship between Jesus and Judas? Did they actually trust each other to the point that Jesus could only use Judas to do the deed? And then you have to ask yourself, here you have the stories that have been used for 2,000 years. Do you trust those stories, Or maybe do you trust a different story? That's something you have to decide. Thank you.